Good morning. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. And now we'll get back to the business of the book, The Global Vatican. Talk about a global government, a global religion, a global social and economic system. Well, it all comes from the Global Vatican. And this is authored by former ambassador to the Holy See, Francis Rooney, and it's a very eye-opening book, and I hope you'll get a copy of it and read it and share it with friends. And share my commentary with them, too, if you will. You'll find it in the archives at First Amendment Radio, and be a subscriber to First Amendment Radio, and tune in and tell your friends. By the way, you can get this book on the major book outlets. This one is published by Rowman and Littlefield, and I highly recommend it. It exposes the extraordinary relationship between the United States and the Holy See, the so-called Holy See, the Vatican. My country, at least always as I was taught in school, was a sovereign nation. It was a nation that was governed by the people through representative form of government. But that sovereignty and that form of government is overthrown when it is dictated to by a foreign power. And that foreign power calls itself the Holy See. It believes it has the moral status to dictate to the governments of the world, and our government as well. Is that what you want for the United States, to lose our sovereignty? To become a vassal of the papacy, which the Protestant reformers called the very seat of Antichrist itself? That's not what I want. And yet I wake up late in life to discover that is exactly what the United States is, a vassal of the papacy. And I think it's high time the American people knew it and did something about it. Now, we'll continue where we left off, backing up just a paragraph for continuity purposes on page 69 of the book, if you're following along. We'll conclude chapter 5 and move on to chapter 6. It says in the first full paragraph on page 69, in 1891, Pope Leo issued what is commonly believed to be his most important encyclical, Rerum Novarum. I spelled it for you yesterday. I hope you had a chance to look it up and find out what it is. The best dissertation on Rerum Novarum that I know about is on Richard Bennett's website. Richard Bennett, as you know, has been a frequent guest here on Inquisition Update. He is currently in the process of moving, I understand. But on his website, you'll find dissertation on Rerum Novarum. Richard Bennett was a Roman Catholic priest for many years and came to know Christ. And he left the Church of Rome. But because he was a Roman Catholic priest and trained in the Pontifical Academy there, he knows how to read Latin. And he knows how to read and interpret papal encyclicals. And you won't know the truth about that papal encyclical unless you hear it from Richard Bennett, who knows best what it's truly trying to say. I would recommend that you take a look at Richard Bennett's website, www.bereanbeacon.com. That's Berean Beacon, B-E-R-E-A-N, just like the Bereans, Beacon, B-E-A-C-O-N.com. And find out what Richard Bennett, the former Roman Catholic priest, had to say about Rerum Novarum. That encyclical is misrepresented by this author. And to go to the truth about Rerum Novarum, you'll find it on Richard Bennett's website. Anyway, I'll continue now. In 1891, Leo issued what is commonly believed to be his most important encyclical, Rerum Novarum. It was, quote, the Magna Carta of social Catholicism, unquote, as one church historian described it. Quote, the movement that more than any other within the church gradually forced Catholics out of their medievalism and state of siege mentality and inspired them to grapple realistically with the problems of the 20th century, unquote. Rerum Novarum outlined a pro-capitalist position that affirmed the inherent rights of the individual under natural law to enjoy the opportunities and benefits of his labor, including wealth and property, contra Karl Marx, but also stressed the obligation of employers to treat labor humanely. Okay, so look, it's an encyclical that delves into most aspects of human life. This is the papacy through this papal thunder, this papal encyclical lecturing the world. It's a position one would expect to take of one who thought himself to be God on earth. Okay? It says later, the progressive movement in the United States would pick up this theme and give it a Protestant twist, but Leo was the first significant world leader. Pope Leo, Antichrist Leo, was the first significant world leader to place democratic capitalism within a framework of moral acceptability. The relationship between the modern, rapidly industrializing world and morality is a preoccupation the Holy See and the United States would share throughout the 20th century. That preoccupation between the Holy See and the United States, in bed together, their preoccupation and the relationship between the rapidly industrializing world and morality is the preoccupation of the Holy See in the United States. Sounds like they're jointly governing the world, doesn't it? Or one is causing the world to worship the other, to worship and obey the other. It's described in Revelation chapter 13. The sea beast and the wilderness beast. Sorry about the frog in my throat. I'm going to have to do something about it. Somebody pray for me out there, will you? Now, he says, slightly over a decade after Leo's death in 1903, the world would take the ugliest turn in modern history. Events in the first half of the 20th century would strain both reason and faith, but they would also eventually draw the United States and the Holy See into a rapport that truly recognized for the first time the common ground these two great powers shared and cherished. The United States, drawn into a relationship that together causes the whole world to worship the first beast. This is a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. Events in the first half of the 20th century would strain both reason and faith, but they would also eventually draw the United States and the Holy See, the seat of Antichrist, I will correct the author, into a rapport that truly recognized for the first time the common ground these two great powers shared and cherished. I would like to ask my listeners what common ground the United States should have with the Antichrist of the Bible. It's a rhetorical question you don't have to answer. Now on to chapter 6. It's entitled The World at War, Part 1. And it begins a quote by Pope Benedict, or rather Antichrist, Benedict XV. It was written in 1917. Quote, "Is this civilized world to be turned into a field of death? unquote. When the papacy worships the destroyer, death is the result. The Antichrist worships Satan, not God, the destroyer. That's who is the father of the Roman Catholic Church. And they hide him under a cloak of Christianity. It's the greatest deception. It's not Christianity at all. Pope Benedict XV in 1917, at the time of the First World War, says, "Is this civilized world to be turned into a field of death?" He asks the question, but at the very time he was writing this quote, his Jesuits had already fomented the First World War. His Jesuits had already fomented the First World War. This papacy, like all the others, was an instrument of the Jesuits. Left in a position to barter for peace, the papacy is left to appear to the world as to be a peacemaker, the man of peace rather than the man of sin. While in the background, the Jesuits were lining up the world for a crusade. And what was the target of their crusade? First of all, for nearly 100 years, for slightly over 100 years at this time in 1917, the secret, most powerful weapon of the Jesuits had been preached in the United States and England, the Protestant countries of the world, and that was called Futurism. The secret, most effective weapon to destroy Protestantism is to destroy the belief that the papacy is the Antichrist. And they did that by propounding the false notion that the Antichrist of the Bible is only one individual that arises on the world scene just 7 years or 3.5 years, depending upon your interpretation, before Christ returns. That belief alone totally exonerates the papacy. No one can correctly call the papacy the Antichrist if they believe in a single Antichrist just 7 years before Christ's return. And that had been preached in the United States in the Protestant churches for nearly 100 years at the time of this writing. And with Protestantism already capitulating, or let's say succumbing to the Jesuit poison called Futurism, the Jesuits were fomenting a global crusade. And their target was the Russian Orthodox Church, which had gotten control of the Russian government, and Protestants in Europe, particularly Germany, and Jews, who had many of whom had sought refuge in Russia. Refuge from persecution, Roman Catholic persecution, the idea that the Roman Catholic Church replaces the Jews as the people of God. And they had fled to Russia. Many Jews lived in Russia. So the Jesuits, by the way, if you don't know this, many of you do, but Lenin and Trotsky and the three main leaders, who the third one whose name escapes me at the moment for whatever reason, were Jesuit trained. They were installed into Russia to open the door for this persecution, to raise the agitation, and as just a cover for the crusade that they were going to run. And likewise, the crusade against the Protestants and the Jews of Europe. There were three who suffered during the First and Second World Wars. Orthodox Christians, that is the Eastern sect of the Roman Catholic Church, which broke off and found their center in Constantinople, that took place in 1054 AD, and the papacy has ever since tried to destroy them as heretics. They either come back to the Roman Catholic Church or and receive and accept the primacy of the popes, or they're going to be killed. That's Rome's strategy always. You either come home to mama or we're going to destroy you. And of course that was the case in the Balkan Wars. That was the case in World War I and World War II. The Eastern Orthodox sect of the Roman Catholic Church is target number one. Target number two are Protestants, also considered by the Roman Catholic Church and canon law to be heretics, just like the Eastern Orthodox, and Jews. Those are the targets. They're religious wars. World War I and World War II were religious wars led by the Vatican against the heretics, the Orthodox, the Protestants, and the Jews. And there's an overall strategy behind the First and Second World Wars, and that is to raise the necessity for the creation of a modern nation state of Israel so that the Jews persecuted in the whole world will have a homeland to call their own, so that the papacy can fulfill its false futurist lie. See, Rome has every intention of bringing forth an Antichrist figure to deceive the whole world, thus leaving the way open for the Pope to rule the world. There has to be an Antichrist. Well, they borrowed from Daniel chapter 9, verse 23 through 27, and took that passage away from Christ and put it on Antichrist. Okay? It was Jesus who caused the sacrifices and oblations to cease 2,000 years ago, in the midst of the week, the 70th week of Daniel's prophecy. But they've reinterpreted it. See, it's the very heart of the Jesuit poison that has been so eagerly consumed here in the Protestant USA. They say that the he spoken of in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27 is not Jesus, but the Antichrist. The Antichrist will cause the sacrifices and oblations to cease. Well, if the Antichrist is a single individual, he comes just 7 years before Christ returns, and he causes the sacrifices and oblations to cease, like Jesus truly did 2,000 years ago, well, then there must be a modern nation state of Israel, and there must be Jews living in the land, and there must be a temple for animal sacrifices to be resumed. And in the midst of the week, the Antichrist will cause sacrifices and oblations to cease. Now, we Protestants know, that the papacy is the Antichrist. Always will be, always has been. That's his prophetic role in the world. But the papacy has deceived the world to believe that he's a man of God. So the papacy, all he's got to do is put forward a false Antichrist who will make a 7-year peace treaty with the Jews, allow them to build a temple, allow them to begin animal sacrifices, and then just simply 3.5 years later cause the sacrifices and oblations to cease. And at that point, anyone who calls himself a Christian in this world will absolutely, undeniably, irreformably believe that that man is the Antichrist, whoever it is. Could be Mickey Mouse for all that matter. So some people say it's going to be Barack Obama. I don't care who it is. If he causes the sacrifices and oblations to cease in Israel after 3.5 years, you won't be able to convince anybody that that's not the Antichrist. The Jesuits have so firmly attached that lie into the hearts and the souls and the minds of Christians that they simply won't believe that the papacy is the Antichrist. There's your man. He signed a 7-year peace treaty with the Jews. He caused sacrifices and oblations to cease after 3.5 years. There's your Antichrist. Don't tell me anymore that the Pope is the Antichrist. And of course, all the time, the papacy is just laughing his diabolical fanny off in his great white throne in the Vatican. But back to the story. Listen, you can't fulfill that phony futurist interpretation, that Jesuit fulfillment of Daniel's 70th week, which Jesus perfectly and completely fulfilled 2,000 years ago. You can't foist upon the world that great deception called futurism unless there's a modern nation state of Israel. So there has to be a need, doesn't there? How could you foment a need for a modern nation state of Israel? Why, relentlessly persecute Jews no matter where they are in the world, until the whole world finally has some sympathy for the Jews. There's your modern nation state of Israel. We've got an answer. Persecuted Jews all over the world, the great Holocaust, 6 million Jews died in the gas chambers. This is just beyond. The world cannot tolerate this kind of injustice. We need a homeland for the Jews. 1948, you got your homeland. The persecution of First World War and the Second World War was enough to drive the Jews to, despite their refusal to go to Israel. Remember, you have to know something about history that's never talked about. Never talked about. Because if you talk about it, it blows the lie right out of the water. Most of the Jews, the most influential of the Jews, during their time of persecution in Europe and Russia and elsewhere, was that we will not go back to our ancient homeland unless God delivers us with the same mighty right hand that he delivered us out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. In other words, they knew they were cast out of the land, and only God was going to bring them back to the land, and they were not going to go unless it was God who brought them back to the land. And they were not going to go back as a result of political eventualities. They wanted to see the strong arm of their deliverer. Okay? So at least a controlling number of the Jews were not in favor of going back to Israel. If they go back without God's sanction, they will be grotesquely punished. And that voice had to be silenced because Rome had to foment that futurist interpretation of Daniel's prophecy. There had to be a modern nation state of Israel. There had to be Jews living in the land. There had to be a rebuilt temple. There had to be a 7-year peace treaty. There had to be animal sacrifices again. And these Jews who say, we will not go back to Israel unless our God delivers us by a mighty right hand, just exactly like he delivered us out of Pharaoh's clutches, they had to be silenced. And that's what the Roman Catholic Church, through Russia and Germany and the First and Second World Wars, did. They assassinated and slaughtered those recalcitrant Jews who would never go back unless God delivered them. That's why that is how the world got the modern nation state of Israel. As a remedy for a man-made persecution against the Jews, that's how they got their modern nation state of Israel. Now, this author's going to write about this period of time, but he's going to give you the popular view, not the historical view, not the prophetic view. This man does not speak according to the law and the prophets, but according to politics and Roman Catholic canon law. For the truth, you need to go to the source of truth. And we'll be back right after these messages.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update. If you would like to hear Inquisition Update continue here on First Amendment Radio, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. And if you'd like to contact me, please do so by email, tom@seawaves.us. Now, by continuing my setup for the reading of this chapter of the book, it's necessary for you to know that Jesus fulfilled the 70th week of Daniel. That was his 7-year ministry on the earth. In the midst of the week, he caused the sacrifices and oblations to cease by giving up his own life. He became the Lamb of God. No more lambs are to be sacrificed. Jesus is the Lamb. Accept him or not. All the Temple Mount ritual pointed toward him. When he came, Temple Mount ritual ended. Your house is left unto you desolate, Jesus said. You either accept me or not. But if you believe in Futurism, Jesus wasn't the Messiah. Because Daniel's 70-week prophecy was all about the coming of Messiah. You see how Satan has twisted your mind? They're ready to proclaim to you another Messiah, one calling himself the Vicar of Christ. And they're going to do it in the future. The 2,000-year gap that you believe in, it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. Remember, Daniel's prophecy had to do with Jerusalem and the Jews. And it ended at the end of the 70th week of Daniel with the stoning of Stephen after he had finally convinced the Sanhedrin that they had wickedly slain their own Messiah, the Lamb of God. That prophecy has been completely fulfilled, perfectly fulfilled by Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the Lamb of God, 2,000 years ago. And if you believe anything else about that 70th week of Daniel, if you believe that it's left to be completed in the future, you've simply rejected that Jesus Christ was the Messiah. I'm sorry to inform you of such a hideous reality, but you can't have it both ways. You can't have a future 70th week of Daniel and then believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Those are mutually exclusive events. It's either one or the other. Somebody explain to me how you can convince yourself of a future fulfillment of the 70th week of Daniel and still claim Jesus Christ to be the Messiah. It's virtually impossible to rationally explain that. And yet that's what the entire Christian world believes today. It's what I was taught for 50 years of my life. Till God woke me up from my drunken stupor, my futurist stupor. God praise his name. But you see, Futurism, the idea that the 70th week of Daniel is not complete and not fulfilled in Jesus Christ, they're the ones who have to fulfill that prophecy, that false prophecy, that Jesuit twisted futurist prophecy, they have to fulfill it, or they lose all credibility, and futurism dies and is no longer taught in the Protestant churches, and they return to what? Historicism. The historical fulfillment that Jesus fulfilled that prophecy. And when you believe that Jesus fulfilled that prophecy, and that there will be no future Antichrist to fulfill that prophecy, no future Antichrist, let me put the emphasis on the right word, no future Antichrist to fulfill that prophecy, then you're back to believing what the Protestant believed, that the papacy is the Antichrist, the correct belief. Futurism is the most lethal poison to a Bible-believing Christian. Now, the Jesuits created that futurist belief. They didn't believe, they certainly did not want the Protestant world to believe any longer that the papacy was the Antichrist and fulfilled all the role, all the prophecies regarding the man of sin, the son of perdition. You've heard it over and over and over here on the Inquisition Update. If the Jesuits, if the papacy ever had a chance to be the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the idea that the papacy is the Antichrist had to be destroyed. So they simply took Daniel's 70th week and applied it to the Antichrist rather than Jesus Christ. And all of that is to exonerate the papacy and then allow some future event to take place, some future Antichrist which they create, put in place to fulfill their version of the prophecy, and once he is destroyed or taken out of the way, then the papacy can rise as the Messiah, the global Messiah. After all, we're reading the book entitled The Global Vatican. That's what it's all about. I hope I'm making sense to my listeners. So they foisted the futurist belief in Protestant America. The 70th week of Daniel is detached by 2,000 years, and it doesn't talk about the Messiah, it's talking about the Antichrist. The Antichrist, not Jesus Christ, the Antichrist will cause the sacrifices and oblations to cease. And they convinced the Protestant world, unbelievably, they convinced the Protestant world. And so now, the United States, a formerly Protestant country, is now the power that the Vatican relied upon to help create the modern nation state of Israel, to help the Jesuits fulfill their prophecy, their 70th week of Daniel prophecy, their futurist interpretation of that prophecy. You see how the wilderness beast causes the whole world to worship the first beast? Is it beginning to make sense now? And the First World War and the Second World War were simply to persecute the Jews enough to require the need for a modern nation state of Israel, to cause a mass exodus to Israel for the Jews. Of course, they had to silence the naysayers, and they did, under the guise of the Second World War and the Jewish Holocaust. They silenced all dissenting voices, all Jewish voices that said, we will not go unless God brings us. And what you got was your modern nation state of Israel, 1948. And at the same time, you got the formation, the initial stages of the formation of a global government. First, there was the League of Nations at the end of the First World War, which the United States was not a signatory to, by the way. Why? Because they wanted a stronger one, and they needed a Second World War to evolve the League of Nations into what we now know as the United Nations. Global government, a global governing instrument run by the Vatican. Now, with that setup, as lengthy and convoluted as it is, can you recognize when I read this quote again, the hideousness of this quote? The papacy, the Jesuits, are ready to turn Europe into a sea of blood. They're ready to involve the United States into it. They're ready to persecute Jews and Orthodox and Protestants. They're ready to create this modern nation state of Israel so they can foment their futurist 70th week of Daniel. And at the same time, they're going to create a global government. Now listen to the quote. See what you think. See what the Holy Spirit says to you. Here's Pope Benedict, Antichrist, let me correct myself again. Here is Antichrist Benedict XV in 1917, just at the beginnings of the first stage of the global war to achieve the Vatican's ultimate goal to rule the world from Mount Moriah in Jerusalem as the Christ. Listen to his statement. Is this civilized world to be turned into a field of death? Now do you see why he's called the man of sin, the son of perdition? He was ready to turn the civilized world into a field of death to achieve his futurist interpretation of Daniel's 70th week and to establish a global government over which he could rule. It's diabolical when you begin to grasp this in its totality. It is truly diabolical. And again, this Roman Catholic author, loyal to the papacy, is oblivious to Rome's intention. And if he's not oblivious, he's keeping it a secret. He's not telling you about it in his book. But here's what he's going to tell you. On page 71, if you're following along, Chapter 6 begins. St. Peter's Square on a warm spring day in the second decade of the 20th century. A vibrant, happy sea of sightseers and pilgrims from around the world gathers before the grandeur of the St. Peter's Basilica. The scene here is a monumental one. It's also comforting but it's also comforting and inviting. Bernini's great curved colonnades reach out from the basilica and embrace all who approach, whether they come to pray or simply to take a photograph. It is difficult to imagine now, but there was a time not so long ago, measuring time by Vatican standards, that is, when St. Peter's Square was an armed camp. Instead of tourists with cameras, soldiers with machine guns occupied the square. The year was 1943. German troops had invaded Rome and crossed the Tiber toward Vatican Hill, rumbling over the bridges with motorized infantry, anti-tank guns, and mortars. They surrounded the Vatican, established checkpoints and sentries, then painted a white line at the edge of St. Peter's Square to distinguish Vatican territory from Italian, or was it now Nazi soil? They were there to quote-unquote protect the Pope, the Germans told the world, but their occupation appeared like a siege. From the barbarians of the 5th century to the soldiers of Charles V in 1527 and Napoleon's army in 1809, there had been a long history of armed men descending on the Vatican to plunder its treasures. But this was something different. Here was a force that knew no scruples and possessed both the means and the will, according to this author, to destroy the Catholic Church. Now, I cannot stop. I cannot continue without stopping to comment. Adolf Hitler was Roman Catholic all his life. His entire hierarchy was Roman Catholic. The SS wore uniforms fashioned in the likeness of the Jesuits, and they wore the Jesuit insignia, the skull and the crossbones, as a part of their uniform. It was Roman Catholic Adolf Hitler that signed the Concordat with the future Pope Pope Eugenio Pacelli, Pope Pius XII, in 1933, protecting the Roman Catholic Church, because the Roman Catholic Church, through Hitler, was going to begin a crusade to destroy Rome's enemies. First and foremost, the recalcitrant Jews that would not go along with the futurist interpretation of Daniel 9:27, and Protestants who read their Bibles and still believed the Pope to be the Antichrist, and, of course, the Orthodox who separated from the Roman Catholic Church in 1054 AD. All three are mortal enemies to the papacy. The Jews are only mortal enemies because if they ever return to their Jewish Messiah, the Roman Catholic Church is toast. Do you comprehend this? It was the author Baron Avril Manhattan, in the most recent book of his that I've read, who pointed out to a Russian KGB agent that the Roman Catholic Church must control Israel, because if the Roman Catholic Church, or rather the Vatican, does not control Israel, then the Jews just might, especially with Protestant influence, might accept Jesus as their Messiah. And if that happens, all claims to the vicar of Christ for the papacy are over. Okay? So it is absolutely imperative that the Vatican get and maintain control of their creation, the modern nation state of Israel, and the beliefs of the Jews living in the land. Because if they ever become Protestant, if they ever believe that Jesus was the fulfillment of the 70th week of Daniel, and that his ministry was the 70th week of Daniel, and it was Jesus who caused the sacrifices and oblations to cease, and it was Stephen whom they stoned when he finally convinced the Sanhedrin that they had wickedly slain their own Messiah, if they ever repent of that, only God knows what would become of the papacy. The Jews would become Protestants. And all of a sudden there would be a shift in the balance of power in the world, and Rome would no longer control the world. If Futurism is ever discovered to be the lie that it is, Protestantism is reborn. Biblical Christianity is reborn, and for the first time in history, maybe the Jews will receive their Jewish Messiah. But as long as God's people believe in Futurism, that's an impossibility. You realize how critical this is? Now, Adolf Hitler, together with Stalin, who were Jesuit trained, they fomented, with the help of the Jesuits, they fomented this crusade. The people at the top of the nations at this time are all on the same page. The papacy's writing the script for all this. The Jesuit generals writing the script for all this. They must fulfill their futurist interpretation of Daniel 9:27. And it's going to take these wars to do it. Now, this author's going to tell you that the Nazis had the will and the means to destroy the Roman Catholic Church, and that they bombarded the Leonine walls, the walls protecting the Vatican, and they invaded the Vatican. But don't you see, that's just so the Vatican has plausible deniability in all this? First and foremost, they must protect the reputation of the Vatican. The Vatican must be seen only as a peacemaker in this whole thing, a neutral peacemaker to try to stop the violence, when all the time it is fomenting all this violence for a very, very diabolical purpose A purpose that is absolutely necessary for the salvation, for the longevity of the papacy. So, this author, deceived beyond belief, he says here was a force that knew no scruples and possessed both the means and the will to destroy the Catholic Church. Hitler had only one concern, and that was to do what his Lord and Master in Rome wanted him to do. And what happened before the cameras of the world was for human consumption, not to reveal any truth. He says the Leonine walls, those walls named after Pope Leo, the Leonine walls, though thick and enduring, would crumble under German artillery. The Swiss Guard, though brave and able, was no match for German machine guns. The Germans promised to leave the Vatican alone, but the promises meant very little. They had broken nearly every one they had made since Adolf Hitler came to power. Something fundamental changed in the world in the early years of the 20th century. Progress itself had brought civilization face to face with a more destructive and dehumanizing ruthlessness than anything Attila the Hun could have devised. Here was the world of which the old popes had been warning since the Enlightenment, a world detached from its guiding principles of future without faith, in which progress turned out to be a force not of creation or cooperation, but of destruction. Can you hear the deception? Just continue. Don't ever lose sight of the fact that the papacy and the Jesuits together are working to foment all of this. It is their desperate effort. He says the causes of World Wars I and II are obviously complex and numerous, and let me just simply add, the truth about World Wars I and II will never be told by the Vatican. You got to go somewhere else to get the truth about the World War I and World War II. It says the causes of World War I and II are obviously complex and numerous, but both wars were responsible for to a secularized Western culture that had been underway since the 18th century. See the deception? The papacy is doing all of this and then blaming it on a departure from Western civilization, which means papal control. Western civilization is governed by the papacy. Whenever you hear the papacy talk about Western civilization, Western culture, it's under papal influence. Okay? As the influence and moral authority of religion waned, replaced by nationalism, the state replaced the church. The new secular states worshipped only their own power, and power led to the exercise of force. Long before the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand of Sarajevo in the summer of 1914, European nations were building up arsenals and preparing for battle to protect and enhance their hegemony. Quote, "War alone keeps up all human energies to their maximum tension," said Benito Mussolini, preaching the theology of the early 20th century nation-state. The Catholic Church would never again exert the kind of influence it held over Europe in the Middle Ages. Do you see the deception? Continuing, the papacy, with the help of the Jesuits and the principals, the leaders of the nations, are working together to foment World War I and World War II, and we're left with this claptrap that the Vatican was a mediator in all of it. A peacemaker seeking a peaceful resolution to all of it. While at the very root of the whole matter was creating a need for a modern nation state of Israel so they could fulfill their futurist interpretation of Daniel 9:27 and create a global government. I hope while I'm reading these words you can just see the deception. Every sentence, line after line after line, is the popular belief, but it is all deception. It says the Catholic Church would never again exert the kind of influence it held over Europe in the Middle Ages. Let me tell you something. The papacy never had the kind of influence that it exerted in the world during World War I and World War II. The papacy never had that kind of influence. Remember the transition to soft power? When the Pope gave up his crown as a temporal king, or was forced to surrender his temporal crown, it appeared for all intents and purposes that the papacy was no longer a king in the world. But look at what the papacy is now. Controlling all of Europe and America and Russia and fighting a global crusade against the heretics to make it possible to fulfill their futurist twist on the prophecy Daniel gave having to do with the coming of Messiah. I hope you're getting this. If you get this, please email me, tom@seawaves.us. I desperately need to hear that somebody is comprehending what I'm saying. tom@seawaves.us. I've run out of time for today. Thanks for listening. We'll continue where we left off tomorrow on the program. You've been listening to Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com.